Hi guys, it's Nicole from the Pearl Review. Hope you are well. Today I'd like to talk to you about a book that made me cry and made me yell out loud, as few nonfiction books have done before. Vanishing New York, How a Great City Lost Its Soul by Jeremiah Moss is a phenomenal book, and I absolutely loved it. It's a book for those not only interested in how New York has dramatically changed in the last 20 years, but also for those wanting to understand gentrification, the vanishing of small businesses, and those wanting to know the major problems that most cities are facing today. This book is informative and passionate. It's at moments brilliant and nearly academic, and others deeply personal and humane. For any of you who have visited, moved to, or lived in a great city and have looked around yourself and asked, man, what happened? This book is also very likely for you. Jeremiah Moss moved to New York in the early 90s, in his words, just missing the end of New York's last iconic era, namely the New York of the 80s. He created a blog several years ago chronicling the closing of historic and beloved businesses throughout the city that have been shuttering at a breakneck pace due to ever-rising rent. People began approaching him to make a book out of his blog, but rather than make a coffee table book, Moss decided to research for and write a book that explains how New York started to vanish. By the way, yes, Jeremiah Moss is a nom de plume, but for sake of simplicity, I'm just going to go with that name. I agree heartily with Moss that there was an old New York that has been in some ways lost to what he calls hyper-gentrification, and that neoliberalism is the main culprit. He's done a great service in this book in chronicling the culture and spirit that the city has lost. He gives an overview, what he calls a Cliff Notes version of the history of gentrification. He discusses deindustrialization, redlining, white flight, benign neglect, and neoliberalism, among other topics. He includes chapters on individual neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, the Lower East Side, the Bowery, Times Square and Coney Island. Those are not really neighborhoods, but you get it. Harlem, Little Italy, and the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx that are most changed by gentrification. Peppered throughout these chapters are elegiac passages describing the stores, places, and people that were cultural institutions that are now gone. He is scathing and polemical about New York's mayors, namely Mayors Koch, Giuliani, and Bloomberg. He is a little more forgiving, though doesn't spend much time on de Blasio. I think he forgives him in part because he knows that there are lobbying interests that he is tied to. He explains how the city government and the real estate industry changed the city from a place that made room for working class people and artists and turned it into a playground for the rich with just enough space for those who serve them. From a place teeming with small businesses to one rife with corporate chains. From a city undeniably its own New York self to a city that bends over backwards for tourists and homogenizes and sanitizes itself in order to pander to them. This smart and heartfelt book is well written. I listened to the audiobook, which was narrated excellently by Paul Haish. I finished this book in 2 days, even though it's about 500 pages. I just couldn't stop reading it. He references many books that sound equally fascinating and references a few brilliant thinkers. Really, the one that sticks to my mind is Jane Jacobs. If you're familiar with her, she's definitely an obvious choice for him. One thing that was particularly powerful was his giving faces to the people who lost their businesses and the people who lost their neighborhoods. I've understood that both gentrification and corporatization are terrible things, but this made me emotionally invested. He convincingly debunks the benefit that gentrification gives to working class communities. As someone who obviously has strong feelings about what New York used to be and the good things that are still there, this was also at times a wonderful indulgence in New York nostalgia. When reading what others had to say about this book, I found most critical gripes a little beside the point. Having grown up around New York City, not in it, I can't claim the insights as those who did grow up there, but I still side with much of what Moss has to say. There was one thing in a Slate review that I read that I personally found valid, that Moss neglects acknowledging the immigrant population still flooding into New York, that New York is less white than it was in 2000, that this aspect of New York's soul undeniably continues, that this cultural infusion is still invigorating the city, and it is doing so like it has for so many generations. That's a good point. Also, there are a few passages that might seem a little redundant, but other than that, I can find no fault with this book and was absolutely floored by it. Moss has been described as cranky and stubbornly myopic, that he loves everything old, he doesn't like anything new. Some critics accuse him of fitting things like the different mayoral administrations a little too nicely into his narrative of gentrification, and that, hey, not all change is bad. But I think he makes a fantastic argument and offers good solutions to real problems. I think he's right to be cranky, and so does he. He is convincing to me on an intellectual and on a human level. I think his heart and his head are both in the right place and would absolutely recommend this fantastic book. Thanks so much for listening. If you have anything to add, please feel free to comment below. Take care. Bye.